tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Well, the questions that are facing attendees here at the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference are mostly of a domestic nature, but occasionally we can look to our friends and colleagues abroad for best practices, things to do, and in many cases, things not to do. I referenced earlier the rather lively discussion between Tony Abbott and Boris Johnson, which was moderated by the always convivial John O'Sullivan, who joins me here today. John, great to see you. Thanks very much for coming on.
Very good to see you, Andrew. Nice to be back together again.
Now, you're not just some foreign interloper in Canadian politics. You actually have a Canadian connection by way of the National Post.
Yes, I lived in Canada for 3 years, almost four, working, helping to launch the Post. With under Conrad, its founder and owner, and under Ken White, who was a brilliant editor, and I think,
and my publisher now to give Ken a plug there.
Well, I think Ken is the most brilliant editor in North America, and I'm always amazed why he hasn't been lured down to take over the failing enterprises there and give them some vim, But
yeah. So you've obviously, by virtue of being involved in the National Post, you've seen actually some of the critical steps in the development of the modern Canadian conservative movement. I mean, Canada, as you're well aware, has obviously taken its cues from the old British Tory tradition, but we also had this Western populist revolutionary party that has really, I think, become the senior partner in this merger with the current Conservatives. And I was wondering if you could situate that in a global context, because there seems to be a shift in conservative parties around the world, not even just in the Anglosphere, that is moving towards what the media would call the far right populist view, but it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Well, yes, it's much more nuanced than that. I would say that the conservatives throughout the world are now a divided group, divided parties, or divided into two different parties. That was the situation of Canadian conservatives back in the, I'm trying to think of the dates now, but something like in the 80s and later. Now, what happened in that case was that two very brilliant entrepreneurs, Preston Manning, who started Reform, and Stephen Harper, essentially campaigned against the Brian Mulroney's Conservative Party. Mulroney had actually very serious achievements to his credit, but he'd lost touch, really, I think, with the Conservative rank and file, outside Ontario and to the west. So, that led to the complete implosion of the Conservative Party here, which, by the way, is likely to happen, maybe not quite so dramatically, to the British Tories now. And so looking at the, so to speak, wreckage, Harper and Manning created a party of which combined the Conservatives of the East with the Reformers of the West. I don't think, populism is a misleading term in my view, because it tends to be the view of the left about the democracy of the right. And essentially what Harper and Manning did was to create a new Conservative Party that represented the Conservative voters of the entire country. And that's not a majority party, but it is now, in the last two elections, it gets most votes, more votes than any other single party. And it is plainly destined, I think, only a huge traffic accident can prevent the Conservatives winning the next election. And that means that they will have been in power a significant part of this new century. And I think that they are a serious governing party, probably going to be the main governing party for some time to come. And I think that the Conservatives in the rest of the world have got to look at them and say, how did this happen? Because we need to do the same thing.
There are interesting dilemmas in Canada, which are really across the Western world in terms of population. We have in Canada a dismally low birth rate. I know in Hungary, where your Danube Institute is headquartered, this has been an issue that has been really front and center for the government there, but it's not one we hear Western conservative leaders talking about. I've never heard Pierre Poilievre talk about birth rate. I've certainly never heard Rishi Sunak or Scott Morrison or any of these guys talk about it. So what can they learn from Orban's party, or even in general, some leaders that have taken up this question?
Well, you say that you haven't heard them talk about the birth rate, but you have heard them talk about immigration.
Yes.
And those two issues are closely related. If you don't produce your own population, then other people are going to come in to fill the gap. And I think that that's something which obviously has been most clearly realized by Viktor Orban, but is also now being seen by British Conservatives looking at the prospective defeat and saying to themselves, look, we've made a mistake in trying to replace our own people who are more and more likely to be not working, to be receiving different forms of social and medical benefit, and retiring early. One of the themes of British life at the moment is where are our own people? Where do they go? They don't come to work anymore. Well, that's an exaggeration, but there's obviously a trend there. So what I think now is happening is serious Conservatives are saying, for some years now, we've been quite complacent about treating our own workers, offering them low wages. If they didn't take those low wages, we'd bring in cheap labor to pay to do the work. And meanwhile, we would pay them through the welfare system one way or another to stay at home. That's not a sensible way to run a country. And that's obviously that's going to be the number one problem to face any government, but particularly the Conservative Party in opposition. And remember, they're likely now to face another competitor on the right in the form of the Reform Party, the equivalent of the Canadian Reformers. And that's going to make right-wing politics much livelier, much more competitive, and with competition, they're going to have to pay attention to their market. In other words, the people who vote for them. And I think they're going to have to turn to the issues that Reform is preaching. And the Conservative Party cannot really write those voters off.
I wanted to, on the note of the UK Tories, see if you could help demystify this, because every now and then people will send me something and say, oh, you won't believe what the UK Conservatives are doing. And I'd say, yes, I can believe it either way. But they've been very strong in some ways on resisting some of the transgender wokeness and on migration. Every now and then they say the right thing and do the right thing. It never seems to last. But then on the other hand, this is a party that went all in on the very worst aspects of the COVID era. It's a party that has gone all in on the very worst aspects of the climate discussion. And I'm wondering if you could explain this, how they can be so strong on some issues and so terrible on others. Maybe you reject the premise that they're not strong on any of them, which is an option.
No, I would say that the problem is in politics, when new ideas come forward, they often come in a deceptive guise as simply reasonable attempts to deal with social problems. For example, the transgender issue is a very serious issue. And at first, if you didn't really look into it, anybody who said, look, these poor kids, they have... Their minds are in a mess because they think they're in the wrong body. Well, we have to really hand them over to the doctors and let them sort their way out to a mental health. And one way forward is to carry out, give them drugs and so on. I think most people look upon this as a policy of kindness. That's the problem. The fact is, it is not kind. It is creating circumstances in which we encourage children to take actions in terms, or to accept actions by doctors in terms of drugs or in terms of surgery that are going to completely alter the rest of their life in ways that 5, 10, 15, 18-year-olds cannot conceivably understand. And that realization did not come quickly, and it hasn't come to everyone on the right or the left, of course, to everyone still. But we are now realizing that this was a mistaken policy, and I think that's what's going to happen now is the Conservative Party is, in a way that much more united way than before, is going to row back from that policy and look for ways of stabilizing and improving the mental health of these kids, rather than encouraging a mass mania that is going to damage them.
And I understand you actually talk about you take on wokeness head on in your latest book, do you not?
Yes, I think I do. But taking wokeness head on is really not a question so much of attacking it as of trying to ascertain what it is and why it's a mistake. And there are so many different aspects. The identity crisis one. Nobody expected that when the identity became a subject of political interest, that it would end up with political parties attempting to deny that there was such a thing as a woman, or there was a clear distinction between a man and a woman, or saying that some women in the Labour Party who believed that a woman was an adult human female.
Just imagine when you were advising Margaret Thatcher, having to sit her down and say, now, Prime Minister, you have to come up with a position on what a woman is. That would have been such a foreign, laughable, that would have been a British telly sketch back then.
Well, it could have been exactly that.
It might have actually been at the time.
It's a great pity that, yes, Prime Minister didn't, in fact, include that topic. I don't think it did. And I'd like to see a version in which it did. But, yes, common sense is obviously generally a guide to policy most of the time, but every now and then political manias occur, and indeed, in a way, my own view is that socialism, left socialism, is a kind of political mania, and we're seeing that in British politics today, and indeed in American politics. When you have seen the actual consequences in practical life of socialism and communism, nobody in 1990 thought it would be a good idea to continue with communism. In the Soviet Union, you couldn't find a communist except in the party, and they were doing well out of it. So effectively, sometimes, and a very interesting example, when Burke originally denounced what was happening in the French Revolution, most of his fellow conservative Whigs and so on, they didn't agree with him. It was much too excessive, exaggerated. He was not demented exactly, but he was taking things much too seriously. A couple of years later, when heads started being chopped off by the guillotine, they came round to seeing that he had realized from the very earliest stages where this kind of thing led. And essentially, that's a very common trend of events in politics. Wokery is now understood to be something that is dangerous. It has it's a hydra. It's a beast with many dangerous heads. But obviously, one of them, transgenderism, is now coming under attack in a serious way from both doctors on the one hand, and also most recently from the Pope. And we don't think of the Pope as someone who rages on about this kind of thing.
No, and to the contrary, my favorite book of yours from nearly 2 decades ago, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, was of a pivotal time in history when the Pope was part of this force vanquishing communism, and the current Pope could learn. Perhaps he should read that book and see what he could be doing. Well, I look forward to reading the new book. John O'Sullivan from the Danube Institute. Wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much.
Very nice to be here.
Thank
All
you,
the best,
John.
Andrew.
Yeah, really good to see you as well.
You. Oh, let me give you the book.
Oh, you brought a prop. Okay.
There it is.
Sleepwalking into wokeness, how we got there. Well, hopefully through that we can learn to get out. Thank you very much, Sean. Always good to talk to you. Wait, is this signed, by the way?
No, but it will be.
Okay, it will be. All right, I'll give that back to you for now, and I'll pick it up after the show.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.